In the troglodyte war of the Western Front, both sides went beneath the battlefield. Miners, or moles as the British had once called them, dug deep, long tunnels and almost on a daily basis fought their war underground. I've often described the Great War on the Western Front as a troglodyte world. Literally, troglodyte, that means people who live in caves. But I think you get the analogy. This was a war, a Tolkien-esque war of darkness, of men living beneath the battlefield, underground, in trenches, in dugouts. And it kind of adds something to the whole atmosphere of what trench warfare was about, this war of trenches, a static war, where in places thousands of men lived along trench lines that hardly ever, sometimes never, changed. So no wonder it felt alien to so many of those who were there. And nothing, to me, really symbolises that aspect of the Great War more than the war underground, the war beneath those battlefields of the Western Front. As soon as the trenches were formed, those with any kind of insight knew that this was essentially a siege war, but one on a previously unimagined scale. And in previous siege wars, it wasn't uncommon for one side to besiege, say, a castle, tunnel beneath its walls, and bring it down, allowing their troops to flood in. But in France and Flanders, the castles were trenches, and to bring them down, men had to tunnel deep under those battlefields and lay charges of explosive. It became a side to the war that characterised those long periods of static trench warfare, and particularly prevalent in those sectors where the front didn't move much, if at all. And today we see evidence of it with mine craters across the old front line, from water-filled mine craters like Spanbroek Molen in Flanders, to the vast open chasm of Lochnagar on the Somme, to a hillside of craters where the village of Vauquois once stood in the Argonne. And I'm sure it is a subject we will return to again and again, because it's so much part of the whole history of the Great War, especially as we gradually visit those places where this kind of mine warfare took place. But to set the scene for this underground war, let's first ask what the British military mindset thought of it on the eve of the conflict, if it did at all. In 1912, an edition of the Military Engineering Manual was published, Part 4, Mining and Demolitions. I'm looking at this red-covered book now. I'm just taking it down off my bookcases, and the copy that I have is signed by a captain in the Royal Engineers that may well have been a tunneler himself. It's easy to believe that military mining was something new to the war that developed out of 1914, or even unique to the Great War. But what the manual called subterranean warfare was far from new. It states, "In all kinds of fortress warfare of which we have hitherto had experience, it has frequently happened that the besieger has had to carry on his advance below the ground, either because the fire of the fortress was still unsubdued, or because he had reason to believe that the besieged would endeavour to check his advance above ground by means of countermines. The recent example of a siege, that of Port Arthur, only serves to confirm the fact that subterranean warfare may have to be employed in similar cases in the future, and further to emphasise the necessity for the training in peacetime of special troops for this service." The manual details how to build shafts, how to use countermines, how to decide what charges to use and implement them. It has information on blasting and boring and the properties of explosive compared to blowing things up rather than lifting earth, which was required to dig underneath something and take out a position that was on the surface. You weren't blowing it apart with high explosive, you were lifting the earth beneath it and throwing what was on the surface up into the air and destroying it. Basically, in this manual was everything that was eventually employed during the Great War. So it's clear that on the eve of war, that knowledge was already there. And when we research it, the examples of mining in military history go back to Roman times. The invention of gunpowder, of course, changed everything, and in the 18th and 19th century, that revolutionized military mining. For example, the Prussians blew a 2,500 kilogram mine at the siege of Schweidnitz in 1762 in the 7 Years' War. 20 mines of between 550 kilograms and 2,000 kilograms were blown at Sebastopol by the French in 1855 during the Crimean War. Pennsylvanian troops in the American Civil War dug a 511-foot gallery with a charge of 3,600 kilograms at Petersburg in 1864, which killed between 250 and 350 Confederate soldiers. And in terms of the Great War, the most recent major conflict was the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 05, and for that generation who were about to go to war, this most recent conflict did indeed, as the above extract that we've just read mentioned, military mining. That was part of that war. The manual had described how the Japanese blew a 5,000 kilogram charge at Port Arthur. So the need for a military mining unit was recognised by the British Army, and if not a unit, certainly the skills to do that kind of warfare. So a decision was made to make that part of the Royal Engineers in the Edwardian period. Officers and men were trained to do that kind of work. Whether it would ever be used is another thing, because this type of war, static siege war, was not the type of conflict that was predicted in those years before 1914. So when Europe goes to war, what would these military miners do? Would they even be needed? In August 1914, Europe does go to war in just 37 days from the shots at Sarajevo on the 28th of June 1914 to fight a conflict that they all thought they were prepared for. As we've said many times on this podcast, Europe was prepared for war in 1914, just not the kind of war that this conflict would rapidly turn into. And we see that within just a few weeks of the fighting beginning, with stalemate setting in following the end of the Schlieffen Plan advance on the Aisne in September of 1914, and by the winter there was a standoff at different points along a huge swathe of Belgium, northern and eastern France, which leads to the whole creation of a trench system that gradually during that winter of 1914-15 is joined up, making what became known as the Western Front, those 450 miles of trenches. So faced with a static war on this unprecedented scale, how to break it? Do you just throw men at it? And when that was attempted, it normally ended in disaster. And what you see is certain nations reacting to the static nature of the war, sometimes quicker than others. The French in particular, who went to war to fight the classic version of that mobile war of movement, with troops operating in vast open spaces. They see the reality of that with heavy losses, particularly in the Battle of the Frontiers, and their troops react to the static nature of the trenches probably quicker than almost anyone else in 1914, with trench weapons, steel helmets, and all kinds of other paraphernalia. But that also includes the necessity and the use of military miners, and probably the French were the first to employ them. They already had a sapeur-mineur corps in their génie, their engineers, 11 regiments of these in 1914, so trained, I would guess, without having unfortunately seen their manual. I suspect it was very, very similar to that 1912 manual for British military mining. Same kind of approaches and the same kind of backstory and what was learnt from previous conflicts. And initially, these sapeurs-mineurs are used to help build up the defences within the French lines rather than take the war to the enemy. But when it's clear that that static nature isn't going to shift anytime soon, they decide to employ their skills to have a go at the enemy positions. And at the village of Dompierre on the Somme, as early as October 1914, French miners attacked the village, which was in German hands, by tunnelling beneath it and laying charges. Some French miners were captured during this period in a trench raid, and they give up details of the kind of work that they were doing. So the Germans, which were always good at reacting to situations, they react with the improvisation of using their own engineers, in this case the 3rd Bavarian Pioneer Company. They were detailed to countermine against the French in this area. And essentially here, you could argue, mine warfare begins. And I think this kind of thing was happening in a number of different places along what we describe as the French part of the Western Front, which in 1914 was the bulk of it. It continues across that French sector into the autumn of 1914-15. At La Targette in northern France, the French blow a charge in December of 1914 and then attack and seize the resulting crater. So that kind of sets a pattern for how this operates. You blow a charge, it forms a crater on the surface, perhaps having knocked out a strong point or a trench, and then you send men over to capture that trench, and you're essentially moving your line forward step by step. And that whole area around Arras, which was a chalk downland, the French realised was particularly suitable for this kind of warfare, and it became a sector for some quite serious military mining, not just in that period when the French were there, but throughout the First World War on both sides, the French and then the British and Canadians in this sector, and then of course on the other side of no man's land, the Germans as well. And as the conflict progresses, the charges get bigger and bigger, with a 3,000 kilogram charge being blown in the Argonne as early as January of 1915. Meanwhile, the Germans are reacting to it. They don't quite form tunnelling units in the same way that the French and later the British do, but they do, using their own pioneers, blow their own mines underneath enemy positions, Allied positions, whether they're French or they're British. And in the British sector, the British cotton on to the importance of this mining from Saint-Éloi to the Bassée Canal, as they see the Germans obviously laying small charges and blowing them in their sectors. And men from the Indian Corps, for example, blow small mines at Festubert in December 1914, an early response to the Germans doing the same to their positions. But at this stage, it was all pretty much ad hoc. There were no specialist tunnelling units in the British Expeditionary Force, and the units that were formed at this stage of the conflict were done on a kind of localised basis. Not every sector had them, and occasionally you see them referred to as divisional mining companies, but they were normally made up of personnel from specific units. So, for example, we've got one, because there's a very good battalion history of the 2nd Battalion, the Monmouthshire Regiment. We know about their activities within the 4th Division at Ypres in early 1915 in the formation and the employment of one of these divisional mining companies. 2nd Monmouthshire's Welsh Territorial Battalion, a lot of ex-miners in it, and their regimental history states, as has been mentioned earlier, a detachment was drawn from the battalion in December 1914 for mining operations. It consisted of Captain A.H. Edwards, 2 NCOs and 12 men, and was called the 4th Divisional Mining Party. In January, it was reinforced by a few men from the 5th South Lancashires. Work was commenced in conditions which the Commander Royal Engineers of the division described as making mining impossible, and certainly their first mine had to be given up when the trenches in its neighbourhood became waterlogged. The second mine was successful, however, despite all difficulties. It was commenced from the cellar of a house a few yards behind the front line, the objective being a row of cottages behind the German forward trenches at Le Touquet. These were suspected of being used as billets and known to harbour some troublesome snipers. When about 500 feet of the mine had been dug, the enemy was heard countermining. A branch shaft was run out about 50 feet to their direction, in which 2 men were constantly stationed, alternately listening for the enemy and striking stones with an entrenching tool to deceive him. Meanwhile, work in the mine proper continued, and it was eventually charged with 30 bags of gunpowder and 24 boxes of gun cotton and tamped. Then early one morning in March 1915, the artillery bombarded for an hour, and at 8 a.m. the mine was fired. Half a dozen of the group of houses went up in the air, and the casualties must have been heavy. So that's a very good description from the 2nd Monmouthshire's history of an early example of British mining on the Western Front in early 1915. And it's clear from activity like this that there was a need for these mining units, proper mining units, within the British Expeditionary Force. But how could you achieve this? Meanwhile, while this was going on the Western Front, the War Office received a letter from a serving Member of Parliament, Sir John Norton Griffiths. He was a civil engineer who had worked on the Manchester sewers and a new extension to the London Underground and in the drainage of London as well, and his men in civil life had developed skill in working in the clay of these two great cities of Manchester and of London, and that was blue clay, which they often call bastard blue clay, that was the same blue clay that was beneath Flanders fields. Norton Griffiths called for the formation of an army of what he called moles to work beneath the battlefield. Initially ignored the increasing use of mines by the Germans and their mining activity in northern France during the winter of 1914-15 brought this subject into sharp focus amongst the senior officers of the BEF, and that British commanders on the Western Front could no longer ignore this. Norton Griffiths' moles were about, it seemed, to become a reality. So who was Sir John Norton Griffiths? Born in Somerset in 1871, he was the son of a building contractor. He'd served in the ranks and later as an officer in the Boer War. In 1901, he married the daughter of a distillery owner, and his engineering career, which then developed, took him to Africa and South America, and on big projects in Britain too. Between 1910 and 1918, he was the Conservative MP for Wednesbury in Staffordshire, and in the Edwardian period, as we mentioned, his miners had worked on drainage in London and in the sewers of Manchester, working in that blue clay and developing what they called clay kicking, which was the improvisation of a special trestle that the miners laid on with a specially designed shovel and some special boots that enabled them to hack away at the clay face at a rapid rate of knots. So when the war broke out, he joined the King Edward's Horse, which was a cavalry regiment, and he initially served with them at home. And after writing his letter calling for this army of moles, he was eventually summoned to the War Office to meet Lord Kitchener. Lord Kitchener was Secretary of State for War, essentially the head of the army. So this was a very important meeting in the whole history of whether these moles would ever be employed, whether they'd ever get off the page in terms of an idea. So Kitchener said to Norton Griffiths, "What are moles?" And Norton Griffiths, rather than describe it, demonstrated the kind of work that they could do, what clay kicking was, with a coal shovel that he whipped out of Kitchener's fireplace. And Kitchener, I think, at first kind of thought this guy could be crazy, but he realised the potential of this, particularly as the Germans were now blowing mines against British positions on the Western Front. And Kitchener said to him, "Get 10,000 immediately." So Norton Griffiths headed off to France to do just that. This led to the disbandment of the ad hoc units that were already there in the British Expeditionary Force and the proper formation of tunnelling companies of the Royal Engineers. The War Office approved the formation of 8 of these tunnelling companies along the British front in early 1915, covering the line as it was, the British sector then, from south of Ypres to the flat fields of Givenchy and Festubert in northern France. The 170th Tunnelling Company Royal Engineers was one of the first to gather its troops. Many of the men who joined it initially had been working on Liverpool sewers just 5 days beforehand, and then been brought into this unit, offered good pay, and put straight into khaki and straight beneath the battlefield on the Western Front to work on these mining galleries. But from a wider perspective, where did the initial miners forming these 8 companies come from, beyond just being dispatched and plucked out of mining jobs that existed already in Britain and then sent to France? Well, there were a lot of miners that were already in the army. Several of the veterans that I interviewed in the 80s and 90s were coal miners. Albert Chesters, who I've mentioned a few times, he lived in Wrexham. He'd worked in the Wrexham pit before the war. he wasn't excluded as a miner from joining the army. And when the war came along, he joined the Royal Welsh Fusiliers and served as an infantry soldier. And when the tunnellers were formed, he was asked to join them, but he had done this really to get out of the pit, get out of the tunnels, get out of the mines, and he never went into a tunnelling company. And I'm sure there were many others besides, but they did pluck quite a lot of men out of infantry units. So 2nd Monmouthshire Regiment that we mentioned, with a lot of those ex-Welsh miners, that's a typical unit in which miners were pulled from that to become sappers in the Royal Engineers and work in these tunnelling companies. But they also went round the collieries and the mines, not just coal mines, but tin mines, and men who'd worked on a whole vast array of different appropriate engineering tasks in civil life. And they were able to go to them and offer them good wages way above what the infantry would pay, in some cases with the coal mines, way above what even the pits were then paying. So it was an attractive proposition for these men. And you saw a lot of miners, particularly older men with families, going straight into these tunnelling companies with good wages and also getting separation allowance for their wife and their children. So financially, for many of these men, it was a pretty good decision. But what you see as those early enlistees into the tunnelling companies recruited in Britain, they reflect the key coal mining areas of Britain, Wales to Yorkshire to Durham to Cornwall and Kent. And then more tunnelling companies were later formed, and the Empire nations joined them, with the 3rd Canadian Tunnelling Company in 1915, and in 1916 Australian tunnelling companies, and later the New Zealand Tunnelling Company of the New Zealand Engineers. When we look at the organisation of a tunnelling company, a typical one consisted of a major commanding the unit, 5 captains, 12 subalterns, lieutenants or second lieutenants, a medical officer, so 19 officers, and with them 550 other ranks, ordinary soldiers, the ones actually doing the mining, with the officers overseeing the whole kind of work. And there is a study in the officers themselves. If you look at the background to them, they cover a huge diverse array of engineering and mining projects right across the world. There were training issues with the tunnelling companies, not so much in training them to do tunnelling, because they already knew how to do that. They were coming with that skill set, which is why they could be plucked from a colliery and sent straight into the trenches to work beneath the battlefield pretty much immediately. The training issue was the fact that many of these men didn't really realise that they were soldiers. So there was a famous incident where a group of tunnellers were out of the line in rest in a village, and a staff car rolled up, and the officer in the staff car expected to be saluted by these men, and they just sat around looking at them. So they had to be taken off and given some basic military training, how to march, how to salute, how to recognise officers, and all the other things that soldiers needed to know. And a typical tunnelling company didn't just have the specialist tunnellers within it who were doing the specialist work to dig the shafts, prop them up with wood so they didn't collapse, or whatever the kind of work was required of them, which was based on their civilian skill sets that had brought them into these units in the first place. They didn't just have them, they had to have a lot of men to do labour. So they frequently had infantry attached to them. And again, one of the veterans that I interviewed was Horace Ham. He'd served with the 16th Battalion of the Middlesex Regiment, the Public Schools Battalion, in the period before the Battle of the Somme in 1916. And he was one of those that while the battalion was out on rest, somewhere beyond Maylit, he was called forward as a working party on a number of occasions to go up to assist the 252nd Tunnelling Company Royal Engineers, who were then digging the Hawthorne mine. And he remembered going down into the shaft, this whole series of ladders to get down there, and one of the jobs he had was turning a wheel that pumped air into the shaft to make it a bit more easy to work in, because there was all kinds of problems with working tens, if not 100 plus feet beneath the surface, which wasn't uncommon for some of these mines, where you'd have foul air, you'd have the build-up of carbon monoxide, which could obviously threaten the lives of the people working within those galleries. So there were tunnellers, there were specialist miners, but also a lot of attached personnel to these tunnelling companies to do the kind of work that they required. If nothing else, the spoil that was dug from the tunnels had to be taken away. Initially, they'd just thrown it over the back of the trenches, and then the enemy had seen a different colour soil and realised that men were working beneath the ground there. So that soil, whether it was chalk or blue clay, had to be taken away from the battlefield to be disposed of properly, and that was the job of the infantry, not the Royal Engineers. So these tunnelling companies by 1915 were operating on pretty wide front of France and Flanders, not just in the Flemish clay, but then the chalk of Arras and later the Somme. And that necessitated different approaches to military mining. In the clay, they had to dig and prop it up with timber to stop it from collapsing. In the chalk and Arras and the Somme, there was a lot more noise involved with digging. So when you look at the kind of tools that they used, the nearer they got to an enemy position, then those tools got smaller and smaller so that they made less and less noise. And all of this had to be learned while they worked in these different conditions beneath the Western Front. So even at this stage, they really epitomised the static nature of this war that had developed on the Western Front, from a war that everyone was prepared for through to this war, this siege war on a massive scale, where the only way in certain areas where the trenches were so close together to do any kind of fighting was to go beneath the battlefield and let these moles do their job and plant charges and blow up the enemy. And the enemy was doing the same, trying to blow up our positions, and both sets of miners, tunnellers beneath the battlefield were trying to take out each other with their own mining galleries, offensive mining galleries, where they'd go for the enemy's positions and try and kill their tunnellers. So this kind of underground war was not about what was happening on the surface. It was about taking on the enemy beneath the battlefield as well. And there were occasions in which fighting took place in some of these tunnels when one side broke into the other side's positions and men were at each other with picks and shovels. So as the war remained static, the use of military miners, of tunnelling companies of the Royal Engineers grew and grew, particularly on certain parts of the front that favoured that kind of activity. And the moles were now formed. Norton Griffiths had got his wish, and despite this increasing use of military miners, it never did really hit that 10,000 that Kitchener had discussed in his office in early 1915. So where do they serve then on this British sector of the Western Front? Early mining was a kind of a tit-for-tat warfare. 173rd Tunnelling Company blew mines at Fauquesart in March 1915 to take on and essentially annoy the enemy who were holding that part of the line in the flat lands around Fauquesart, which was close to the village of Neuve-Chapelle. Hill 60 became a kind of epicentre of mining up in Flanders, close to the city of Ypres, where both sides had met on the hill, gone underground, and mine after mine had been blown, British mines, German mines, to a point where by 1916 the mine craters were no man's land, with British trenches on one side of the craters and the Germans on the other side, and their positions literally not even probably tens of yards apart. And the same was true in one or two other kind of choke points where a lot of military mining activity had taken place. The village of Saint-Éloi to the south of Ypres, for example, and up on the Bellewaerde Ridge near to the hamlet of Hooge along the Menin Road. That was an area of classic mine warfare for over 2 years of the First World War, which there's a lot of visible evidence of today, with mine craters still in existence, and the unique Royal Engineers Cemetery, which we've discussed in a battlefield vlog on our YouTube channel. And if you look for the links on the oldfrontline.co.uk website, you'll find the YouTube channel, and the videos about this are on there. And one of those who was particularly active up on the Bellewaerde Ridge, and indeed other parts of the mining sectors of the Western Front, was Major Edward Momba, who was the officer commanding 177 Tunnelling Company. They spent a lot of time in the Bellewaerde sector, something like 2 years on and off, and Momba blew 2 mines, one here at Bellewaerde and another one on Vimy Ridge, resulting in craters that were named after him. Momba Crater at Vimy and Momba Crater at Bellewaerde. To my knowledge, only the one at Bellewaerde survives. The one at Vimy disappeared because it was very close to, or is now perhaps beneath, where the motorway runs as it comes down past the Pimple and touches the fringes of the Vimy area. But I think that Mamba crater does not survive. Mamba was a fascinating character, born typical of these tunnelling company officers, born in France, the grandson of a decorated French Crimean veteran. He was a pre-war regular in the Royal Engineers as an officer, served in a fortress company of the Royal Engineers, and he became one of those early tunnellers. And he died while commanding 177 Tunnelling Company at Messines in June of 1917. He's buried in Lissenherk Cemetery, just down from Nellie Spindler, where Nellie Spindler, the nurse who is buried there, just down from her grave, in a row that is essentially an officer's plot. And it's quite a nice journey to kind of follow Mamba around from Vimy to see that surviving crater at Bellewaerde and then visit his grave at Lissenherk. An example, a classic example, as we've said, of one of the many tunnelling company officers that served in this strange underground war. And elsewhere in the new chalk battlefields that the British increasingly took over from the French, like the Hohenzollern Redoubt near Loos, the tunnellers plied their trade there too. In April 1916, for example, both sides were active at the Hohenzollern Redoubt, with 25 mines being blown, 13 of these German and 12 British. And by May 1917, this is still going on, and then 36 mines were blown, 17 of which were German and 19 were British. And when you look at aerial photographs of the Hohenzollern Redoubt area, it is a massive minefield with crater after crater after crater, some of which are still there amongst the rubbish tip that is part of that site today. In June 1916, the Germans blew what became known as the Red Dragon crater, and when many of these mines were blown, they were given numbers or names on trench maps, and increasingly, certainly by the British, the use of names identified craters so that they could be written up in reports of raids and patrolling in no man's land, and refer to particular parts of the battlefield where attacks might take place. But the explosion of the Red Dragon crater by the Germans in June 1916 resulted in the award, a posthumous award of the Victoria Cross, to sapper William Hackett. He was the only tunneller to get the VC in the Great War, not for blowing things up, but he was a man that stayed at his post when the German explosion wrecked the tunnels they were in. The roof was coming down. He had a chance to get out, but injured men couldn't be evacuated, and he stayed with them. And for sacrificing his life to try and save these men, he was awarded a posthumous Victoria Cross. He was typical of a lot of those early tunnellers. He was a man in his 40s with a family, had 2 children, and they were kind of thrown into poverty in some respects by his death. His son went straight into the Manvers Colliery where he'd worked, which is near Rotherham in South Yorkshire. And when I lived in South Yorkshire, I kind of followed William Hackett around that area, seeing the memorials, seeing where he'd worked. His name is on the Colliery Memorial, which still survives. There was a special memorial to him in the town of Rotherham, which is now in a memorial park. And they put a blue plaque on his house where he lived. And his son, as I say, had gone into the colliery after his dad, but he was hit by a coal truck and lost his leg. And it was a very, very difficult time for the family, reading between the lines of the accounts of their life after the war. So this great hero, Sapper William Hackett VC, the only tunneller VC of the Great War, you sometimes wonder, with the families of these men who had been awarded the Victoria Cross, whether that was a kind of a bitter pill in trying to continue to live their lives once the conflict was long over. Elsewhere, mines continued to be used in the Battle of the St. Loire craters. British and Canadian soldiers have been involved in the fighting there, and 6 mines totalling 73,000 pounds of explosive have been utilised in those operations. And elsewhere, other choke points that became famous for mining activity included places like the Bluff, Vimy Ridge and Bois Francais, and those are all places today on the old front line where we will find evidence of this. Big, deep craters in the Bluff. It's now part of the Paling Beak Park, and you can walk round there. There's a little visitor centre that tells you the story of it, and there's a nice kind of duckboard walk that takes you around the craters. Vimy, if you've been to the Canadian Memorial Park, you'll have seen the deep craters in the area between the 2 sets of preserved trenches, but right across that part of the ridge where the Canadians fought in 1917, most of them craters from a much earlier period, when the British were there in 1916, and then up at Bois Français, which is an area we've discussed a few times in the podcast, where Siegfried Sassoon and Robert Graves were in 1915 and early 1916. The mine craters from that pre-Battle of the Somme period are amongst the trees and the woods up there. And this is one of many, many places along just the British sector of the Western Front where you'll find evidence of this mining activity. But as we've said, the British use of mines and both sides' use of mines was not just about destroying what was on the surface. Countermining and camouflage were very much part of this mine warfare. And this is where tunnellers worked beneath the battlefield in separate mining shafts to try and take on the enemy tunnellers, listen for them, seek them out, and then blow a charge that didn't send its blast upwards to the surface, but it sent it sidewards. That was the camouflage, blowing in the enemy's tunnels, destroying their mining galleries, and hopefully killing many of their tunnellers besides. And the British were doing that to the Germans, the French doing it to the Germans, and the Germans doing it back to both of them in spades, excuse the pun, as well. So that was part of it as well. And sometimes there would, as we've said, be an effort to try and actually break into the tunnel systems. And there are many accounts in the many books on tunnellers in the Great War in which you can read about tunnellers breaking into an enemy position and fighting taking place beneath ground. Now, these tunnels are not kind of super highways. They're not built to move lots of men. They're quite small, quite compact. And in most cases, tunnellers weren't able to carry weapons up towards the forward face of their workings. They might carry sidearms like Webley or Colt pistols, but not rifles. So when this kind of fighting took place, as I said, it was medieval. I mean, the whole kind of siege warfare was medieval, but the kind of fighting that then took place within these tunnels was medieval and barbaric in its nature, where men were using improvised weapons to have a go at each other. So the war underground quite literally was a war underground when tunnellers of both sides met in their tunnel systems. Now, there were occasions, as we've said, where the conditions within these shafts could be critical to men who were serving in them, that carbon monoxide could build up and men would collapse as a consequence of this. And there were mine rescue parties, and this was something that they, again, kind of seeped into this from the civil experience of mining, where mine rescue parties were a standard part of how collieries worked to rescue men when they were trapped beneath the surface. And these were used extensively. And when you read the accounts of different parts of the battlefield where mining was taking place, very often you hear about tunnellers being overwhelmed by the conditions, the gases, the noxious gases within the tunnels, lack of air, carbon monoxide. And there were quite a few instances in which men went down to try and rescue their mates but got overcome themselves, which is why these mine rescue parties with specialist breathing equipment to get down there and pull men out were such a vital part of it. And one simple little thing helped them in the detection of these noxious gases that could build up in the tunnel systems beneath the battlefields, and that was a canary. We spoke about this in the episode on birds on the Western Front. And canaries, and in some cases small animals like mice, were used in cages, taken down into the tunnels, and they were very susceptible to, for example, carbon monoxide. And if the tunnellers saw that the canary had fallen off its perch, or the mouse was lying in its cage with its legs in the air, stone dead, then obviously there was carbon monoxide. You can't smell carbon monoxide, but this was an indicator that it was present. But what they found was that these men, the tunnellers, developed a great attachment to the canaries and the mice and the other animals that were used, and wouldn't take them down into the tunnels in case they did get killed. And there's some quite good accounts of this in the reports of tunnelling officers after the war. And it was said, in fact, that the life of a tunneller depended on the length of a canary's claws. They had to clip the claws of the canaries so they didn't grip the perch in rigor mortis. If the canary's claws were short, it would fall off the perch. If they were long, it'd grip the perch and it would look as if it was still alive, when in fact carbon monoxide was everywhere. So this was all part of this strange war, this war beneath the battlefield. So up until 1916, the tunnelling companies were used largely on a localised basis to react to a situation on the battlefield, to blow up a position, to take on enemy miners, to countermine beneath the battlefield, rather than being used for a big offensive. And the Somme, the Battle of the Somme, which began on the 1st of July 1916, was the first time that the tunnellers were used to lay large offensive mines to help in the overall operation. And that saw, for example, the explosion of the Hawthorne mine, 40,600 pounds of ammonol explosive, filmed by Geoffrey Malins, photographed by Baby Brooks, the official photographer, immortalised really as the kind of standard image of what one of these mines going off looked like. But elsewhere there was the Weissap mine of £40,000. Lochnagar was in fact 2 charges of £36,000 and £24,000, which was the largest British mine up to this point. And to the southern part of the Somme battlefield was the Tambour mines, 3 charges of £15,000, £9,000 and £25,000 of explosive. I mean, already you can begin to see just how much bigger these offensive mines were. And at Carnot there were 2 small mines where the 6th Battalion of the Royal Berkshire Regiment went over the top, and the explosion of those mines interrupted their advance and caused heavy losses amongst that unit. One of many occasions during the war in which mines went off and took out friendly forces. But there were lessons from the implementation. I mean, there's a whole podcast in just those Somme mines, and we spoke to Professor Peter Doyle about mines on the Somme in a previous episode, but there is another podcast just by looking at those particular craters and the other mines that were blown elsewhere. But the lessons of the Somme, one of the predominant lessons of the Somme, was where you actually blew the mine. In most of those examples, if not all of them, they were blown directly underneath a forward German position, a front line position, which took out some Germans, but not many. So in the case of the Hawthorne mine, months and months of work, 40,600 pounds of explosive, it killed less than 30 German soldiers. So what was realised, if you actually continued tunnelling, so you dug underneath no man's land, you went under the German frontline trench and you continued to the second line, because what the British discovered on the Somme is that the Germans favoured putting dugouts in the second line positions, in the support lines as the British would call it, and that meant that was where the bulk of their defensive troops were. So if you blew a mine in the front line, you kill some Germans, but the bulk of the garrison would survive. If you continued and then blew a mine underneath the second line position, that support line position where the dugouts were, you might kill much more of the defenders and give the attacking British and Commonwealth forces a much greater chance of success. So that became a major lesson of the war underground that was experienced on the Somme in the summer of 1916. So at this point, the moles are now very much part of the battlefield. They've proved their worth, lessons had been learnt, and as 1917 dawned, their biggest operation ever was just a few months away. And perhaps this might be their finest hour. Norton Griffiths' moles had been working beneath the Western Front for nearly 2.5 years by early 1917. They proved their worth in local operations at different points along the front, and in major offensives like the Battle of the Somme. But as yet there hadn't been one big moment to prove their worth on a grand scale in this most static of static wars. Plans for an attack along the Messines Ridge had already been in place in 1916, because Sir Douglas Haig, who was the Commander-in-Chief, was a man for whom the British sector in Flanders was the main British sector on the Western Front, and he planned to shatter the German dominance of that ground by using tunnellers on a big scale to literally blow the Germans off the Messines Ridge. And some of that work had been planned and indeed begun in 1916, but the Battle of the Somme had got in the way. But many of these mining galleries that would eventually be used for the Messines battle were already in place, and in some areas, some tunnelling companies had used quite a lot of different methods to prepare them. Major Cropper, who commanded the 250th Tunnelling Company, had, for example, used a mechanical mining device. He'd bought it, brought it over to Flanders, disassembled it, taken it down into the tunnels, rebuilt it, and set it on its way, and it used a blade to cut through the blue clay. Initially it worked quite well, but gradually, as it got further and further into the clay, it would clog up on a regular basis, and it was really more trouble than it was worth. So they sent it on a little side tunnel, it chugged away for a little while, and then it stopped, the blades jammed up, and they sealed that off, and they left it there 90 odd feet beneath Flanders Fields, where it is to this day. And some years ago we very nearly persuaded the BBC to excavate that with the help of Johan van der Walle, who some of you may know runs the De Dreva Cafe near Polygon Wood, an extensive, highly experienced subterranean archaeologist. He had been looking at this for some time, but as yet the mechanical mining device purchased and used by major croppers, tunnellers, remains beneath those Flanders Fields. And so the Somme then had kind of got in the way of Messines, but in 1917 there was a move back towards resuming operations in Flanders and attempting to reset the advantage that the Germans had had here since the very earliest months of trench warfare. In 1914 on the Messines Ridge, the Germans had captured it and they'd held on to it, and we'd tried to take it back with infantry assaults in that winter. They'd failed, and it was realised that just sending men forward to try and take a ridge like that would just result in heavy losses. And General Plumer, who commanded the army in that part of the battlefield, set his staff officers off on coming up with ideas as to how the capture of the ridge might be achieved, and that led to the implementation of tunnellers on this bigger scale. Planned initially, as we've said, for 1916, but then delayed because of the Somme until the following year, and then greatly expanded upon as a plan. So a number of mining galleries opposite the Messines Ridge front were already in place. New ones were prepared once the offensive was confirmed, and for the first time in one of these mining offensives, it wasn't just British tunnellers doing the work, but Australian and Canadian tunnellers doing it too. The plan was to blow as many as 24 mines from Hill 60 in the north to Plugstert in the south, each of them tens of thousands of ammonite explosive and gun cotton. And these were generally much bigger charges than had been previously used. In the end, 19 mining galleries were selected as suitable to be used, and they were then blown at 3:10 on the morning of the 7th of June 1917, the opening day of the Battle of Messines. But prior to that, some that weren't used were not used because they were discovered. So one mine at the Petit Douve farm was discovered by the Germans in 1916. And following a below-ground action, when British tunnellers were faced with German tunnellers, that system was flooded and abandoned. A second mine at a position known as Peckham Farm wasn't used, and some to the south were considered of little use by General Monash, who commanded the 3rd Australian Division. So 19 mines were in place for this great mining offensive. Many of them multiple charges, others large single charges, including the largest mine used at Saint-Éloi, which totalled nearly 96,000 pounds of explosive, and that was the largest British mine of the war. And when you add them all up, essentially, together they total nearly £1 million of explosive, and they're aimed to be blown as simultaneously as possible, and this would herald in really a new phase in the war underground by this massive explosion on a hitherto unknown scale. The French had never done this, the Germans had never done this, and British and Commonwealth forces were about to do this in 1917. General Sir Charles Harrington, Chief of Staff of 2nd Army, whose sector this was, said, "Gentlemen, I don't know whether we are going to make history tomorrow, but at any rate we shall change geography." And that kind of summed it up. What would this great mining offensive bring? If nothing else, it would change the landscape. So those 19 mines blown at 3:10 on the morning of the 7th of June 1917 caused a devastating effect, but only, and this is an important factor that's not always considered, but only in conjunction with the terrific bombardment that was part of the larger Messines plan, with one of the largest barrages to date. The mines alone could not destroy the German positions, allowing men to advance. They could help, but the artillery, by this stage of the war, before this stage of the war really, the artillery was the king and queen of the battlefield, and it was now reaching a perfection that hitherto had been unknown, and that, in conjunction with the mines, turned Messines into a changing point in the war, and arguably one of the most successful British battles of the static period of trench warfare on the Western Front. Now, when we discuss the Battle of Messines and the use of those 19 mines, there's some really good articles by historian Simon Jones on his website, and I'll put a link to that on the podcast website for you. And what we see when we read some of the accounts of the tunnellers and we look at Simon Jones's work, we see that there's quite a lot of myths, really, about the Battle of Messines. One, the mines were blown from north to south. I remember watching a documentary some years ago in which one of the contributors kind of pointed to the Messines Ridge and described how the first mine went off at Hill 60, and then one after another, the whole ridge erupted from north to south. That isn't true. If you'd have been an observer standing back from the front and looking towards the Messines Ridge in those early hours of the 7th of June 1917, you'd have seen a mine go off here, another one here, another one here. It was not any kind of organised, clear pattern from one position to another, from north to south, from south to north. It wasn't organised like that, and there were some delays in some of the explosions, which meant that was always going to be impossible anyway. So that's one of the myths. They didn't go off from north to south. The other one is that the mines killed 10,000 German soldiers in an instant. Now that's a phrase that I've uttered myself in the early years of my guiding career until I'd read more and more about the story of the mines at Messines and also looked at some of the German accounts. And what we see, there were indeed 10,000 German casualties during the Battle of Messines, but not 10,000 Germans killed by the explosion of those mines. Some of the accounts of the work of tunnellers have kind of leapt on that figure to prove really what the mines were capable of doing, this terrible, devastating effect of blowing these 19 mines, nearly £1 million of explosive. It had snubbed out 10,000 lives in an instant. I don't think we'll ever be able to work out exactly how many Germans were killed in the explosion of these mines, but when we look at the different sectors where mines were used, and because they were blown in those second line or support line positions where the dugouts were, you see less defenders available to throw the Allied, the British and Commonwealth infantry assault back. So they definitely succeeded in helping that assault, inflicting casualties on the enemy, but not on a scale of 10,000 Germans. This is all part of our kind of learning experience. There are some great kind of little factoids thrown around, some of which are true, others not so true. And it's important to present real history, I think, rather than duff history. Another facet of this is that the mines were heard in London, so the explosion of these 19 mines was heard in London. And I remember reading one account that said they were picked up by a seismograph, I think in Switzerland, that thought it was an earthquake. And that I've not really explored. But in terms of the mines being blown in London, there is an account, where this comes from is an account in the Times newspaper on the 8th of June 1917, so the day after the battle began and the day after these mines went off, and it states, "It is understood that the Prime Minister had the satisfaction of hearing yesterday morning the report of the terrific mine explosion with which the new offensive on the Western Front opened. Preparation for the event was naturally of long standing, and when the plans were perfected, notice was given, privately, of the exact hour at which it was proposed to carry them into execution. Accordingly, Mr. Lloyd George, who was staying at Walton Heath, gave orders that he wished to be called at 3 o'clock yesterday morning, evidently in anticipation of the explosion. He was duly called, and he and others heard clearly the tremendous shock." Now that's reported in the Times the day after, and it's mentioned in quite a few accounts of the Battle of Messines and the employment of the tunnellers in the Great War. There is evidence, of course, here that that took place, that was heard, but there's quite a lot of doubt as to whether that was possible, whether they heard the tremendous bombardment. And we know with accounts of people living in Kent how the bombardments from the Western Front, particularly in Flanders, which was only 50-odd miles away from places like Dover, could drift across that landscape and be heard in the towns and the villages of southern and eastern Kent. Whether that reached London, I don't think we'll ever know. But again, it's a kind of great story. This unprecedented explosion, picked up by a seismograph, heard by the Prime Minister in London. What must it have been like to witness in those trenches in front of the Messines Ridge in the early hours of the 7th of June 1917? Another facet is that there are lost mines. We often hear about the lost mines of Flanders, and I'm sure there's at least one documentary that kind of looks at that. And they're not really lost, because if we look at almost all of the accounts of the tunnellers, the published accounts, they list all the mines and they show the charges that were used and they show the charges that were not used. What there is, rather than being lost, we know where they are, and these charges are still there beneath the battlefield. The flooded mine at the Petit Doux farm. When we made a programme with Simon Verdingham about his archaeological work at Messines in 2012, we went to the Petit Doux farm, and the farmer opened up one of the German mining shafts, which was flooded, pumped out some of the water, and they sent a subterranean drone down there to kind of explore it. It was in exceptionally good condition. We could see the ladders and the lining of the tunnel and so on, but we weren't allowed to continue in case the drone went straight into the part of the tunnel where the charges may be, because with the Germans breaking into the British tunnels, effectively those tunnel systems were now connected up. But that charge is still there, tens of thousands of pounds of explosive beneath that Flanders farm. And it's not the only one. There's one near Peckham, near that Peckham farm on the Messines Ridge near to Whitshire, White Sheet, and of course there are the Plugstert mines to the south. And we know about the British mines, we don't really know about the German ones, and I've recounted the story of Andre Becker, who used to run the Krunart Wood Trench Museum all those years ago, who reckoned that there was a German mine coming out of the mining galleries there towards the British positions beneath the Messines Ridge. So that kind of legacy of the underground war, the tunnellers' war, that is real. The fact that they're lost is not really true. And they're not confined to Flanders. There are mines, unexploded mines under other parts of the British sector of the Western Front as well. If you look up the Durand Group, you'll see the explorations they've done of Vimy Ridge, for example, and the search for some of the mines that may still be beneath that position. And one of the other myths, as kind of smaller myths of this, and I'm not even sure if it is a myth, I've never found any clear evidence for it, and I'd love to hear from any listeners who know more about this. I remember reading an account, and I tried to find it when I was doing the research for this podcast, but I can't, that one of the mines unearthed the bones of a woolly mammoth, and that a tunnelling officer went forward who'd been an archaeologist and recognised what they were, and those bones were taken back to the British Museum. Now, I don't know whether that really is just a great exaggeration. We know that there were occasions in the war in which archaeology was found and was taken home. In Salonika, they found examples of Greek soldiers' burial chambers, for example, in some of the trenches that were dug there, and bits of archaeology were found at Gallipoli. And Will Bird, who was a Canadian soldier who served with the Black Watch of Canada, he found a Roman sword in a trench on the Somme in 1918. So that kind of thing did happen. Whether at Messines, with the explosion of this mine and this big gouged hole out of the landscape there, whether that exposed the bones of a woolly mammoth, I don't know. But again, these kind of things make great stories, but we have to be careful with the truth. So in terms of the kind of myths of Messines, that's some of them. Not really a myth, but one of the sadder bits of this is that there's no film or photos of the mines that went off. This great mining offensive, unique in the Great War, and there's no photographic evidence of it. 3:10 in the morning, there's no way cameras that existed then could operate in that kind of light or lack of light. So the only photographs that we have are aerial photographs of the craters that were formed, and then ground level photographs of the craters as well. I picked up a photo album some years ago of a British officer who went round the Messines Ridge just after the war and photographed some of the craters as they were in 1919-20. So that kind of evidence exists, but the wartime photos of the actual mines going off, they don't exist. But when we look at this battle and the explosion of these 19 mines, one thing that is clear is that on the battlefield, it was the largest man-made explosion of the war on the battlefield. Nothing similar would be seen, really, in terms of warfare until the atomic bombs a generation later. And for Norton Griffiths, that idea that he demonstrated with a coal shovel on Kitchener's office floor had finally seen his moles bring off the biggest mining offensive of the conflict. The mines at Messines had helped achieve victory. It was the tunnellers' finest hour, but in some respects it was their final hour too, because Messines was a point in which the war changed. Static warfare kind of came to an end, and the war became far more mobile in its last year or so, the lines swinging to and fro. Even at Messines, within 9 months or so, the Germans attacked in what the British called the Battle of the Lys and swept over the Messines Ridge once more, and then Allied forces pushed them back in the late summer and the early autumn of the same year. And that was true, the pendulum swinging like that was true on much of the rest of the Western Front. So static warfare had led to the birth of the moles of the tunnellers, and when static warfare went away, that meant that their war kind of came to an end. And what you see tunnelling companies being used for in that final phase of the conflict largely is to create galleries to move troops underground from one position to another. That was done extensively at Ypres in late 1917, for example. They worked on dugouts and positions beneath the battlefield, but they weren't blowing mines like this again. So Messines was the kind of pinnacle of their war, and it was a bit of an anticlimax really for them afterwards. But nearly 4 decades after Messines, a thunderstorm blew one of the lost Plugstert mines. Lightning struck the ground, and enough of a charge went into the soil, touched the detonation cables, and blew one of the mines. And suddenly the legacy of that underground war came alive again. But beneath the battlefield today, some mines still remain, as we've said, at Petit Douve, at Peckham and Plugstert, beneath Vimy Ridge, and no doubt elsewhere. All of them, in many ways, waiting to turn another page of Great War history, or hopefully remaining silent for all time. Elsewhere, mine craters, which now resemble ponds, hide the scars of war from over a century ago. But as swifts swoop low over the water of these craters, feasting on insects, the occasional visitor pauses to look pensively into their dark waters. Those craters remain like beacons to that strange underground war, that war of moles. And the crumbling tunnels beneath those Flanders fields are different kinds of criss-cross pathways, this time deep below the old front line. You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcorps. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline.